Hi, everybody. I'm Frank Reese from Cappella Books. Thank you for joining us tonight for what promises to be a very special program. We have been looking forward to this night for many months. In fact, early this year, we learned that we might very well have the opportunity to host Professor Anita audience. And up until just a few weeks ago, we held out some hope that that would happen, but the pandemic has had other plans. So we've gone virtual, and we're glad that you have joined us here. And we're also thrilled to be joined by Ambassador Andrew Young. And from the very beginning, when we planned this program, we wanted to reach out. I should hold up Anita Hill's book first, Believing, and by Anita Hill. And the subtitle is Our 30-Year Journey to End Gender Violence. So we wanted to have an Atlanta organization that was fighting that fight alongside of the fight that Anita Hill writes about in her book. And that organization is Atlanta Volunteer Lawyers Foundation. And so tonight we are happy to also welcome the director of the Atlanta Volunteer Lawyers Foundation's Safe and Stable Families Project, and that's Jamie Perez. So I'm going to turn it over to Jamie. She's going to say a few words about their organization, and then she's going to introduce our two illustrious guests. And I should also mention that all of you who are watching tonight are watching because you purchased a copy of Anita Hill's new book from us. And by doing so, you will be receiving a copy signed by Anita Hill. And a portion of every one of those purchases is going to benefit the Atlanta Volunteer Lawyers Foundation. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Jamie Perez.
Thank you so much, Frank, for allowing me the honor of introducing our speakers this evening. I am the Director of Intimate Partner Abuse Programming at the Atlanta Volunteer Lawyers Foundation, and we are grateful to Cappella Books for putting this on and making us a beneficiary of the proceeds. My organization is the largest provider of pro bono legal services in the metro Atlanta area. We train attorneys to represent survivors of intimate partner abuse and tenants in landlord-tenant disputes. And we also have a host of social workers and other staff on our team to support our clients through those processes. I have the privilege of making this introduction tonight because of my organization's work advocating and providing legal representation for survivors of intimate partner abuse. But as Professor Hill shows us in her book, we cannot end intimate partner abuse without addressing the root cause of the issue, gender-based violence. Professor Hill's book, Believing, Our 30-Year Journey to End Gender Violence, reflects in its title how lengthy the process to effectuate change in this field can be. In her book, we learn that change cannot only be individualized, we must fight to make it societal, institutional, cultural, and intersectional. And not just intersectional in terms of an individual's identity, but in how each component of gender violence, such as intimate partner abuse, stalking, sexual assault, and sexual harassment, affects the others. She tells us that in addition to being anti-racist, we must be anti-gender-based violence. To quote her, ad hoc anger won't suffice. Our attention to the problem must be unceasing. When that fight seems overwhelming, we can look to Professor Hill's experience and work for inspiration. Her book is a reflection on the history of gender inequality that begets violence, a call to action, and a strategy for those of us doing this work. And it will surely inspire those who haven't yet joined to take up the cause. With that, it's my honor to introduce you to our two speakers tonight. Ambassador Andrew Young Jr. graduated from Howard University and went on to become an ordained minister after attending Connecticut's Hartford Theological Seminary. While serving as an activist in the civil rights movement and as executive director of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, his work was integral in the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. He later served in Congress before leaving to become the first African-American U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. He served as the 55th mayor of Atlanta, was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and has authored several books. Ambassador Young has continued to work throughout his life for human rights and economic justice. Professor Anita Hill earned her psychology degree from Oklahoma State University and her law degree from Yale University. She became the first tenured African-American professor at the University of Oklahoma's College of Law and currently serves as University Professor of Social Policy, Law, and Women's and Gender Studies at Brandeis University. Her courageous testimony during the 1991 U.S. Supreme Court Senate confirmation hearings led to the Year of the Woman in 1992, with women being elected to Congress in numbers our country hadn't seen before. Since then, she has authored several books, and her trailblazing work on behalf of women's rights and against gender violence has been unceasing. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Young and Professor Hill. I'll start off with the first question, and I, of course, want to invite our audience to go ahead and put any questions they may have in the Q&A as we go. So, Professor Hill, I want to start out by asking you, for those that are not familiar, what is gender violence?
Well, I think the easiest way to define what I mean by gender violence is to take a look at what I cover in the book. You know, I started this whole journey because of my testimony about sexual harassment. But in the weeks, actually in the days following my testimony, as I returned back to Oklahoma to my teaching, I started getting thousands of letters and phone calls from people from all over the country and all over the world, actually. And what they talked about was each one of them talked about some behavior. Nearly everyone talked about behavior that they had experienced that was abusive and violent and aggressive. They not only talked about sexual harassment, they talked about other forms of abuse that they had experienced. And one of the most compelling moments was in a phone conversation that I had with a man who said to me that, you know, he was very hesitant at first, but eventually he opened up and he started talking to me about why he called. And he called because he wanted to tell me that the hearings reminded him of his experience. His experience wasn't sexual harassment. His experience was, in fact, incest. And what he said was that the senator's reaction to my allegations of sexual harassment were really very similar to the way his parents acted when he told them that he was being abused. And what he said to me was that, you know, you have opened a whole can of worms. And I started to try to figure out what that was. And the answers were actually coming to me from victims and survivors around the country. As I was listening to stories, not only about incest and not only about from women, but from people of all genders and people of all races. And it occurred to me that I wasn't dealing with that in order to get to the problem or the understanding of what my own experience, I really had to understand the experiences of abusive behavior that other people had. And ultimately that all included intimate partner violence, which you're familiar with, your work is familiar with. It included sexual assault and rape. It includes stalking. It includes bullying in schools. And it includes the kind of sexual harassment that happens on college campuses, that happens in high schools, and basically behavior that occurs throughout the lives of people. And the common denominator is that much of that behavior, much of that violence and aggression occurs because of an individual's gender. And so when I started to try to address the problem, I knew that I was not going to be able to solve any one problem, whether it was sexual harassment or sexual assault or rape or stalking, unless I took a look at the whole of the problems, see how they were interconnected, and dealt with it as the huge problem that it is, that is part of our culture and part of our systems. I believe you're muted.
It will happen in every time someone's on Zoom, right?
I know.
You mentioned about how you started to get into this work, and I know you've mentioned that this is not something you asked for, and actually Ambassador Young gave you some guidance about that. Can you tell us about that?
Well, I would love to tell it, but I would. He tells it so beautifully.
We can
Uh,
pass it over to Ambassador Young if
but
you'd like.
I will. Well, just to go to the setting. I visited Spelman College. I was invited to speak at Spelman. It was one of the very first speeches that I had given after the hearing. I was fortunate enough to visit with Ambassador Young as well as Lillian Miles Lewis. And the conversation still remained with me and really inspired me to start to be serious about what I could do about the problem. So can you tell us, Andy? I'm not used to saying Andy, but
that's fine. But I really can't tell, because as I did tell you, I think that being a father with 3 daughters and only 1 son, and I've been married twice now, 40 years to a raging feminist from rural Alabama. And then she passed with cancer, and I've married again for the last 25 years. And it seems as though I get along best with strong, independent women who keep me as humble as possible. I mentioned that it started when my daughter, who is now chairman of American Civil Liberties Union in Georgia, she was just about 12, 13 years old. And I said something about the girls at the office. And she just screamed, "Daddy, you don't have any girls at the office. As long as you've been fighting to stop people from calling you boy, you have young women at your office." Well, that was my introduction to strong women in my own family. And it doesn't get any easier. That, they're from 30, well, older than that. But even my 6 and 3-year-old grandchildren, and a great grandchild now of 3, they're all very strong, independent personalities. And I think that's the way it's supposed to be. But it's a job helping to develop young women with the same independence. And in fact, I would have to say that that's one of the concerns I have about our college life here in Atlanta. That Morehouse is all male, Spelman is all female, Agnes Scott. I mean, there are different models of education that are shaping our society. And as part of my UN experience, you can't help but notice that the countries where the women are the most independent are the countries that are doing better. That Rwanda, after the genocide, the women took it over, and they have an overwhelming majority in the parliament, and things just work better. I think we see it almost everywhere. And coming out of Afghanistan, the main reason most of us felt that we needed to be there was what was happening to women's rights. But that's true of a whole section of the world. So we're not talking about a personal problem in the office alone, or personal relationships, or even in our own families. We're talking about a global confrontation.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, and that's one of the things that I talk about in our book, that one of the reasons that we haven't done more is that we try to personalize and diminish the problem to a personal problem that we want individuals to work out themselves. But when in fact, what we have is a problem of abuse, whether it's sexual assault or rape or intimate partner violence, that affects not only the individual victims, direct victims, but affects neighbors and neighborhoods, communities, and on and on. And they affect our nation. And in fact, our inability to address the issue in our country will impact our authority to lead around the globe. And so we have to, we are really called upon at this time for a response if we are going to be credible around the globe. You know, you talk about your daughters really being sort of part of the inspiration for why you are so dedicated to gender equality. You know, that's one of the things that I have heard since 1991. And when men do approach me to talk about sexual harassment and how they are against it, they say, well, I didn't really understand it until I thought about it in terms of my daughter. And that brought them to this realization that we need to fix the problem. Now, I wish that they had gotten there when they thought about their spouses and their mothers and their grandmothers, because this problem's been going on for generations. But however we get men involved as allies in this cause is a route. It's part of how we're going to start to resolve it. But another thing that you had mentioned to me in our conversation was about how I could proceed. I was at a crossroads at that moment, and I had given many speeches, and I didn't really know what I wanted to do, much more than I wanted to just return after the hearing to my life before. And you, in talking about Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement, you may have been one of the first people who actually linked what the issue of gender violence and harassment to the civil rights movement of the 60s. But what I so appreciated from that conversation was your encouragement of me to take up the cause, even though it was a cause that I hadn't chosen. And you talked about Dr. King in that visit as well.
You know, he really went to Montgomery because he wanted to stay out of Atlanta politics. And the Dexter Avenue Church in Montgomery is clearly one of the most conservative Baptist churches, but it's a church that probably had more women PhDs than you'd find percentage-wise anywhere else, because there were 3, Talladega College, Tuskegee University, Alabama State, University of Alabama, they were Auburn. They were all around there, and the teachers lived in Montgomery, and most of them chose that church for their membership. And it was actually, Martin Luther King was 25, and he was in the, nobody knows what a mimeograph machine is, but he was running off of flyers for the one-day boycott. And the 2 ministers, one Methodist and one Baptist, got in an argument about who should be the leader. And the women came together and said, why don't we, if we go with either one of these men, why don't we start with this young man back in the mimeograph room and let him be the spokesman for this one-day protest. And that was how his leadership emerged. He never forgot that. He always knew that these struggles were connected. And when the Civil Rights Bill was passed, the amendment to include women's rights was added in jest because the congressman who introduced that amendment thought that that would be a way to kill the bill. Instead, it brought more support, and it linked the struggles of civil rights and feminine rights and freedoms.
I know you've got some questions, Jamie, but can I just jump in and talk about another way? Specifically, the whole issue of sexual harassment was linked to the civil rights movement. And I don't know, that may be where you were
Please
headed.
do.
Well, so, you know, the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964 and included the protections of gender discrimination as one of the protections that people had relied on. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act for years to protect individuals against workplace discrimination. But the idea of a claim of sexual harassment as a violation of someone's civil rights was something that really didn't come into being until the late 70s. And it was introduced as a concept by Catherine McKinnon. When it was introduced and people began understanding it, a number of the very early cases that were brought by Black plaintiffs, Black women who were complaining about civil rights violations in the form of sexual harassment. In many cases excluded sexual extortion. Some of the cases even included some racial and sexual language and slurs. But it was a judge named Spotswood Robinson that really clarified the connection between the racial protections and the gender protections when it comes to sexual harassment. There were a lot of judges who had simply said that sexual harassment wasn't a violation of the law. But Spotswood Robinson looked at the cases and he said, he brought up the similarities between Blacks being relegated to certain jobs or being demeaned in the workplaces and told that they weren't fit to be able to do certain positions or take certain positions. He brought up the connection between those two types of behavior that said that the law was intended to protect against gender discrimination in the same way that it protected against race discrimination. And he was so persuasive that he wrote some of the earliest opinions from the DC Circuit that allowed sexual harassment to actually ultimately be decided by the Supreme Court to be a violation of a woman's civil rights, as opposed to what some other judges thought it was just, well, this is just what men do. And this isn't anything that the law is going to protect against. That judge was Spotswood Robinson. And we found out earlier that then Professor Spotswood Robinson was teaching at Howard University, where Andrew Young was a student. And you knew of him.
I did. Well, that was I I was at Howard University in the years that the moot court run through of the 654 Civil Rights Act. And Howard University was the center of the debate and also the arguments. And lawyers from Yale and Pennsylvania and Howard would get together in these moot courts, and these issues would be argued. Well, I've never been in a moot court, but I knew about it. And everybody on the campus knew what was going on when there was, because you had Thurgood Marshall also there as a professor. Well, it was the issue of the time.
Well, both of you have been leaders in, fighting against racial injustice and gender injustice. So one question I wanted to ask, and Professor Hill, you put this question in your book, what is our vision for gender justice? And the same, I can ask the same question, what's the vision for racial justice? So can you two talk a little bit about that, what you see being, I guess, our ultimate goal?
Somebody asked me what's the most pressing issue that women face, and this was about 15 years ago, I think. And instinctively, I said, at that time, ending violence against them based on their gender. Because it seems to me pretty clear that an individual can have all the other rights. They can have the right to education that's promised by the law, the right to work that's promised by the law, right to vote. But if that right can be wiped out by an act of violence, then those rights are meaningless. So I think, and this was before I started really doing work and looking at the whole of gender violence. But I am absolutely certain that if we don't get a handle, if we don't start solving these problems, that all of the other rights will be undermined. And that includes, and we see it happening. We see it happening in the workplace. 50% of the women who experience sexual harassment will change jobs, and some will change careers because of the harassment they experience. I've heard countless stories about women who have left schools because they experienced harassment, often at the hands of a teacher or professor, but often at the hands of peers, classmates. So again, I think we underestimate the impact that this problem can have, and until we get a handle on it, our idea, our concept of gender justice that's based on rights will be completely diminished and undermined.
I almost think that in a city like Atlanta, we probably have in our perimeter a couple of 100,000 students. And I think you would find that one of the most serious problems that we face is rape. And that it comes in very subtle and acceptable forms in fraternity houses, and but let's go back to the Bible. In every culture, the sanctity of women has been one of the major struggles. Rabbi I think Heschel, when I spoke with his daughter at an occasion at Boston University, Um, she was the most raging feminist I think I'd ever talked to. And it was based on her, I mean, she's a feminist theologian. And she talking about the role of the oppression of women in religion. And I think you'd have to say that that's still a major problem. A really major problem. And I mean, I'm not a feminist. Well, I don't know what I am, but I mean, what the Supreme Court's doing, and what the states, I mean, the states are trying to do. I mean, can you think of the Supreme Court having a religious mandate for circumcision of men? You know, men wouldn't stand for it.
Right. And don't be afraid to call yourself a feminist, Ambassador Young. It's a good word. So one thing that I wanted to ask about, right now, one of the biggest cases in America is Gabby Petito's case. I'm sure you both have probably heard about it. And one of the reemerging phrases that's coming out is missing white woman syndrome. I'd like for you, if you can, Professor Hill, to speak to the intersection of gender-based violence and racism. Obviously, people of color have a compounded effect when they are victims of gender violence. So can you talk to us a little bit more about that, given that we have this national story going on right now, and this conversation about why aren't we focusing more on people of color when things like this happen to them?
Yes, I mean, the numbers are there. The violence against Black women and the murder rates of Black women at the hands of people who they're familiar with, some in cases partner with, they exceed the rates of the women's population in general. If you look at Native Americans, Native women, 1 in 2 Native women will experience sexual assault. There's a whole campaign about missing women from Native tribes, women who've just shown up, who just disappeared. So it's been an issue that hasn't gained a lot of traction. I was in Utah for an event, and I was waiting in line, and these 2 Native women came up and said they had driven 4 hours because they were just looking for somebody who could carry the message about the missing and murdered women, Native women. Some of them were from their tribe, but from tribes all over the country. So we have that problem that if you look at the figures, you know that the risk of violence for women of color, particularly Native Americans, Latinx, and Black women, is higher than for the general population. We know that when they complain, they are least likely to get any kind of response from officials. We had a survivors conference about a year or so ago, maybe a year and a few months now. And one of the things that survivors at this conference said, especially survivors of color, said was that, well, I don't go to the police, even though these were women who had been survivors and victims of rape. They didn't go to the police because so often when they go to the police, they're the ones that are treated like criminals. And so the problem is twofold. It is racism and it's misogyny, and it's the two combined. And the problem with the violence against Native American women can be traced back to colonialism and the problem with violence against and the response that they get can be that Black women can be traced back to slavery. This past weekend, this Sunday, yesterday, Kimberly Crenshaw wrote a absolutely outstanding, compelling, and chilling analysis of the R. Kelly trial, and pointed out that for almost 3 decades, there had been complaints about R. Kelly's trafficking and abuse of young girls. There was even a video of the sexual abuse of a 13-year-old. And yet it took over 2.5 decades and a racketeering charge to actually bring him to a reckoning. And so, that can be traced back to not just the fact that rape victims are not believed or they're not treated with the kind of respect and seriousness that they deserve, but also can be traced back to racist beliefs about the value or the lack of value of Black women. And so it's something that we have to address. We can't, in fact, expect to end violence against Black women without being anti-racist. I mean, we have to take into account the racism they're experiencing, as well as the misogyny that is part of their experience. And so it's a lot of work, but I talk in believing about the work that needs to be done. And some of it needs to be done within our own community. Some of it needs to be done in the greater community and the authorities and the systems that they come up against in order to have their claims addressed.
Well, and I'd like to talk a minute about some of the changes that could be done. So in your book, you talk extensively about some of this, but it's been 3 decades since your testimony, and then we had Dr. Christine Ford's testimony. Tell us if anything has changed in the last 3 decades that you've seen, but specifically, I know that you wish there was more change in the way those hearings were done, and I'm hoping you can tell us a little bit about that.
Well, the hearings that you saw in 2017 or 2018, which was the Kavanaugh hearing, and the hearing that you saw in 1991 were strikingly similar. And there were differences, but there was, I was talking about sexual harassment that I experienced. Christine Blasey Ford was talking about sexual assault that she experienced, and that's different. There's a difference in the behavior that we were both discussing. But one of the things that is not so different is the process. The fact that the Senate Judiciary Committee in 1991 had no process for someone who had a complaint. There was nothing, and the reason that there was even a hearing that happened was that the Senate was basically shamed by the public, and which was led by a number of congresswomen going over to the Senate side and saying you should be having a hearing on this, because there were only 2 women at the time in the Senate. So there was no place to go. Even though the Senate approached me to get my statement, I gave them my statement. They didn't know what to do with it. There was an investigation by the FBI, but it wasn't clear who the FBI was representing. And in fact, we know that those investigations now are really under the command of the president, and that was true in 2018. We know that in 2018, the investigation was limited. It was to taking the statements of the two principal parties involved, Kavanaugh and Blasey Ford. So what you had was different behavior that we were both talking about, but ultimately the same flawed process, if you want to call it a process. I mean, witnesses were omitted from my hearing that should have been called. Witnesses were called that never should have been called because they had nothing relevant to say about what happened. So I think that we can start with thinking about the process that we would like to see change, processes that we would like to be changed. There are still workers, and not just me and Christine Blasey Ford, that don't have anywhere to go, but there are still workers around the country who don't really have a process to go to. And the number is growing because of the number of gig workers in the economy, because of independent contractors. Someone wrote me this week and said, don't forget to say that volunteers aren't covered when they're harassed. So the law is not perfect. It's not covering everyone that needs to be covered. And so we need to be addressing those holes in the law. We also need to be addressing some of the cultural issues about how we talk about and how we treat victims. The first question, Ambassador Young was talking about the problem of rape. Less than 1% of the complaints about rape that go to the police, less than 1% in convictions. Yet, when we talk to people who say they've been sexually assaulted or raped, one of our first instincts is to say, well, what were you doing? Where were you? What were you wearing? What time was it? This woman named Michelle Bowdler has written a book that says, is rape a crime? Because so little prosecution of it happens. And in fact, she tells her story of talking after a brutal rape, she reported to the police, she did everything she could. And the officer who was taking her complaint said to her, well, you're lucky you didn't get killed. And he didn't say, it's a terrible thing that happened to you. He said, you're lucky that you didn't get killed. And so I think that whole attitude then gets built in our systems, and it did turn out that there was no investigation of her complaint. So we've got a combination of problems here. We've got to deal with the behavior, but we also have to deal with the culture that gets embedded into processes that fail to protect us.
And what about you, Ambassador Young, as a former congressman? What do you think needs to happen within our government to effectuate those changes?
Well, I think that we're having a legislative, the Me Too movement. There's been quite a lot of publicity. Now, I noticed the case law is much slower than the publicity. And it takes so long, and it's such a painful process for the victims involved that it's very hard to get women to pursue this. But I can trace it back to my childhood in New Orleans, where it was after the slave trade. that the whole Creole phenomena in New Orleans was a result of forced race mixing. And it was involved, I mean, the church was involved. There's, you know, let he who is without guilt cast the first stone, and there's nobody around to throw stones. And I think that's an indication of how long and how far we have to go.
Yeah.
And I guess most of what I get, I'd have to consider gossip. And I don't like to be involved in that, but people are always anxious to tell. It almost makes them feel better to get it out of the system. And I can remember when this became political in, I think it was 1967 in Mississippi, when in the civil rights movement, all of the Black women and the white women got together and they had a meeting without the men to talk about the sexual abuse. And as a result, the men voted to get rid of the white folks. And they went to Chicago, and that's where the National Organization of Women was formed. And the white men ended up with the Students for Democratic Society, for the most part. But these were movements that came out of the sexual abuse that was prevalent in the 60s. And I think that, well, it's up and down, but those of us who were in the civil rights movement knew that this was something that we had to struggle with as a major form of injustice. And as it began to apply to our own families and as we began to see it in our own backgrounds.
Yeah, and it seems like there's a lot of people willing to acknowledge it's a problem and then not perhaps take it as far as they should. And Professor Hill, I know that you, leading up to the 2020 election, received an apology from President Joe Biden. And I know it had been a long time coming, and there was some pieces of acknowledgement and understanding missing from his apology. Can you talk to us about that? And my personal question related to this is, do you have any plans or intentions to follow up to get him there, to get him to where we're hoping he will be?
Well, I'm certainly working on that, and the book is part of it. You know, the whole chapter 10 is really my ideas about what the leader of the free world can do to address this problem. You know, you mentioned Puerto Rico has declared this as a public crisis. I think, you know, the evidence is there. It's a public health crisis. You know, when 10 million intimate partner violence victims exist every year, and a third of them go homeless, it's a housing crisis. When you add in sexual harassment, you realize that the economy is affected. When you realize that 2 people on the Supreme Court have been called as out for sexual misconduct, that there is a trust problem in terms of trust in our institutions, whether they be the Supreme Court or campuses are reeling now because Students now have gotten fed up with sexual assault in fraternities, and they are protesting on campuses throughout the country, peaceful protests, but very clear that they are demanding change. It is a crisis level in so many ways, and it takes leadership to deal with those kinds of crises. If the numbers themselves don't compel you, and those are certainly compelling, the impact that it is having on us as a society ought to. If the numbers of victims who are suffering doesn't compel you, then the impact that it has on our institutions, think about the military and the problems there. So, and I talk about that, and but what you first have to have is a leader that's going to acknowledge the problem. And right now, we don't have that. So that's where I would like to start. There was a personal apology to me for what, as Joe Biden said, what happened to me in 1991 and his mismanagement of the Senate Judiciary Committee's hearing. That's only one part of it. There needs to be an acknowledgement of what happened to our country when people viewing that process lost faith in the government's ability to serve victims and survivors of abuse, to enforce the law when it became inconvenient because there were powerful people involved. And so I think what and made choices that I believe and many others believe were not in the best interest of our country and our courts. So we have to start with acknowledgement. And then we need a leader that is going to commit resources. Because if you think about how pervasive the problem is and how it impacts so many different functions in our lives, whether it's education, housing, work, the criminal justice system, the civil justice system. When you think about all of that, we need a president who's going to commit resources and direct agencies to come up with comprehensive plans for how their agency is going to first do everything needed to prevent the problem of abuse, and then secondly, to respond and provide resources for victims and survivors. And then I could just say, the solutions themselves are not all instant. They're not going to be done overnight, but we have to start. And one of the most important elements of starting is to call upon survivors and victims for their input. Because we have over the past 30 years in this journey, we've got a lot of knowledge, and survivors have found platforms and have knowledge to share about what they need and how their problems might have been prevented. And just take the intimate partner violence that you dealt with. The people are more vulnerable when they lack resources, when they lack opportunities and ways to escape abusive relationships. And we need to figure out what those are, whether it's making sure women have economic security throughout their lives, or providing them with education, and ability and housing, so that they don't have to stay in abusive situations. So I don't think I don't have the blueprint, but I think there are some steps that they can take. And then there are some symbolic things that can be done with shoring up the Violence Against Women Act, making sure it gets passed, reconfirmed. as well as making sure that, in particular, federal protections are robust. So those are the things that it comes down to. I say that Joe Biden, as a leader of the country, needs to take a lead on this issue. But I also think that every corporate CEO and university president and principal and schools and superintendents and schools also need to take the leads, because that's where the problems are happening. And we didn't talk about the problems in elementary school, but I do believe it.
Let's add an hour on, because I think we could spend a lot of time on that. Well, I know the social workers in my organization would agree with you that the resources are always so tight that we could definitely benefit from more federally allocated resources, state allocated resources for our survivors.
Let me say something that I probably will regret, but way back, I was, well, I don't know, early 20s at least. The one of the books that fascinated me was The Fall by Albert Camus, and I can't get rid of that book, and because as I remember it, the writer is walking across a bridge across the Seine River in Paris, and hears someone drowning, and continues walking and ignoring it. Well, I happen to have been trained as a lifeguard, in college and on the swimming team. And that scene I can't get rid of, because especially now, I know I would not go into the Seine to try to help somebody get out. And so it leaves all of us men, not all of us, but some of us who are sensitive, with a sense of, well, I think the phrase that Camus used was judge penitent, that we judge something, but we know we're also guilty of it. And I think that I don't know a better man, a more sensitive man than Joe Biden, particularly on these kind of issues. But all of us have a burden of guilt for something. And I think I've been fortunate to have been reminded for at least 50 years by my own family. I cannot make a slip without somebody correcting me. And I think that's one of the ways to deal with this in, well, for me, it would be in a Christian forgiving mood, but nevertheless, establishing the level of involvement and guilt or shame or vulnerability.
Well, I do think that,
and let him who is without sin cast the first stone.
Yeah, I think that one thing we probably all want to do as part of this conversation is call people into it, as opposed to calling them out, and inviting people to engage in this fight.
I like that.
To the best of their ability. I know we're just about out of time. One quick final question I wanted to ask Professor Hill before we go.
Can I go back and emphasize your thing? Call us into it, not call us out.
Correct, and I did not coin that phrase.
We all men sin and fall short of the glory of God, and women do too.
Exactly. One final question, if I could, Professor Hill. We're focused on how far we have to go, given what's happened in the past 30 years, but are you at all encouraged by the progress that has been made in that time?
I'm encouraged by progress, any progress, even if it's not the final solutions to our problems. And I would love for everybody to read the chapter of in which I do talk to Joe Biden, because I do believe I called him in by talking about how he had been courageous enough to pledge to end cancer when nobody really believed that he could end cancer, but he was courageous enough to do it. And I called him in for his courage then, and simply urged him that getting rid of this problem is going to take the same kind of courage and commitment, and acknowledging some of the work that he's already done that gives him a special place to address what needs to be done in the future. The changes that have happened over the past 30 years are clear and evident and so important. That's what keeps me hopeful. The fact that students are now out protesting, and it's not just that they are protesting, but they are understanding how the problem has become part of our institution's problem, not just individual behaviors. They're not, trying to attack individuals. They're calling on institutions to rethink and to work with them. And I think that to me is encouraging. All of the research that has been done, all of the people who have committed their lives to addressing the problem over the past 30 years, starting new organizations to support survivors. I don't think that there's ever been a better time to be in this fight. Not only because of the urgency, but because our resources are so great. And I do think that the public is ready. I think that there is a change in public. There was a change in attitude that showed up after Christine Blasey Ford testified. So we can build on that. And I believe that we deserve better and that we can be better.
Thank you. And I'll pass it over to Frank. But one final thing that I will mention, at first, I want to thank you both so much for being here. And if you haven't read Professor Hill's book, she said she doesn't have the blueprint, but I will say that in reading the book, there is quite the start of a blueprint there. And it's inspiring and encouraging to all of us to take a look at that and start to do the work set forth with her guidance. So thank you so much, Frank.
Thank you, Jamie, very much for moderating a really wonderful discussion, and it is a great starting point. Professor Hill's book is the next place that all of us should go. Thank you all out there for purchasing the book. You'll be receiving it shortly. Thank you, Ambassador Young, for being part of the conversation. And again, thanks to all of you out there for the support you've shown to Cappella Books, and in particular on this program, to the Atlanta Volunteer Lawyers Foundation. Have a great night, everybody.
Can I just say thank you?
Hill. Yes, ma'am.
Can I just say thank you? I mean, I want to thank you, Frank, Cappella Books. I want to thank Jamie for great questions and great moderating of the conversation. And I want to thank Ambassador Young for being here and sharing his wisdom and experience and time with us. I just can't imagine a better conversation to bring us together on this topic. So thank all of you and thank your audience.
Yes. Thanks so much. Have a great night, everybody.
Thank
Bye.
you.